here's the motivation for why we should look deeper of stagnation, right? Which is that economic growth rates have generally been lower than comparator countries, and we've gone through these cycles of booms and busts, which are now happening increasingly frequently. So it seems that we can't just rely on individual choice as an explanation for these trends that have been happening for a much longer period of time. Okay? So that brings us to what the underlying conditions are which give rise to this. And so in a recent analysis that I did, and I'm again, by no means I'm not the only one who said this. There are many other authors. Ayaz Malik has written about this. Asim Sajjad Akhtar has written about this. Adil Malik has written about this. Is that the current crisis is a product, or it sort of emerges at the confluence of several different things, right? One of which is demographic change. The Pakistani society and the population itself has undergone a pretty dramatic shift over the last few decades, and it's increasingly skewed towards a younger population, right? So we're looking at about 64% of the population is under the age of 30, right? This is a what people call the youth bulge, or the demographic dividend, or the demographic disaster, whatever sort of view you want to take it. But that's certainly one defining feature of Pakistan as it currently stands.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fiscal Focus on DawnNews English. This is Danish Khan. I'm Assistant Professor of Economics and Political Economy. Generally speaking, there are two broad ways to understand and conceptualize political economy and developmental contradictions of Pakistan. And the first approach is to focus on individual-centric explanations. For example, person X is the cause of Pakistan's economic woes, or the personality clashes between different heads of institution. On the other hand, is second approach, and which is to look at the political economy from a holistic perspective and analyze the underlying systemic factors such as institutional structures, class processes, and power asymmetries between different groups. There are a lot of discussions in the mainstream of Pakistan focusing on the first type of explanation, that is focusing on personality clashes. But in this podcast, our goal is to go underneath the surface to examine the underlying processes. So we'll focus on systemic issues today, trying to make sense of Pakistan's economic and developmental challenges. And to discuss this, I have Professor Umair Javed with me. He is professor at LUMS and a regular contributor to Dawn op-ed pages. Thank you, Umair, for joining me today.
Yeah. Thanks, Danis. Pleasure to be here.
So recently you wrote a piece highlighting this issue and arguing that we need to look at the underlying causes of these contemporary problems and contradictions in Pakistan. So tell us, what is that approach of looking at underlying causes?
Yeah, so I think we could start with what is the problem that we're trying to diagnose, and so we can look at the problems in two or three separate domains, right? So there's a problem in the political domain, which is sort of this recurring conflict between civilian political leaders and the military establishment, and that this ends up being fairly destabilizing, and it means higher turnover in government. Decision making doesn't necessarily correspond to what the constitution says, and so on and so forth. So there's the political domain of the crisis. And then we have sort of a longer crisis, which is a crisis of economic growth or economic stagnation, right? And these are two things that are often kept in separate boxes when we're analyzing, when we're analyzing sort of the state of development, political and economic development in Pakistan. So I think, and obviously the conventional analysis, as you laid it out right at the start, tends to look at personality clashes, personality-based decision-making problems as a justification or as an explanation for why we have these distinct crises, both in the economic domain and the political domain. People make bad choices, or people are corrupt, or people are morally sort of compromised, and that's why we see all the problems that we currently see. Now, there's one can obviously be sympathetic to this worldview. One can have space for individual-centric explanations for why things happen, but as political economists, which is what both of us are, we tend to look a little deeper for explanations, right? And here's the motivation for why we should look deeper. The motivation is of stagnation, right? Which is that economic growth rates have generally been lower than comparator countries, and we've gone through these cycles of booms and busts, which are now happening increasingly frequently. So it seems that we can't just rely on individual choice as an explanation for these trends that have been happening for a much longer period of time. Okay? So that brings us to what the underlying conditions are which give rise to this. And so in a recent analysis that I did, and I'm again, by no means I'm not the only one who said this. There are many other authors. Ayaz Malik has written about this. Asim Sajjad Akhtar has written about this. Adil Malik has written about this. Is that the current crisis is a product, or it sort of emerges at the confluence of several different things, right? One of which is demographic change. Pakistani society and the population itself has undergone a pretty dramatic shift over the last few decades, and it's increasingly skewed towards a younger population, right? So we're looking at about 64% of the population is under the age of 30, right? This is a what people call the youth bulge, or the demographic dividend, or the demographic disaster, whatever sort of view you want to take it. But that's certainly one defining feature of Pakistan as it currently stands. The second sort of defining feature is this economic stagnation, right? And the economic stagnation, we need to sort of consider this economic stagnation not just as a crisis of bad decision making, or elite capture, as is sort of often said, but rather there is a fundamental crisis of not being able to configure productive forces in the economy in such a manner that they're able to reproduce themselves in a sustainable manner, right? So capital and labor, the two foundations on which any economy is functioned, we have not been able to find a combination that puts these two together and is able to sort of create output in a sustainable manner. That's an underlying structural problem as far as the economy is concerned, and you can trace it all the way back to the 1970s and perhaps even earlier. And then the third major disruption that we see happening is the way that people associate with each other in society, right? The way that people engage not just with sort of their immediate friends and sort of social networks, their family members and so on, but how they engage with strangers and how they engage with people in different positions in society. That has changed through what we call technological disruption, right? And that technological disruption is largely being made possible through sort of the revolution brought about by increased cell phone use, and obviously cheaper broadband data. So collectively, these three act as what we can classify as the building blocks of the present moment in Pakistan. Youth bulge, economic stagnation, which is a productivity crisis essentially, and the third is technological disruption. That is what I think really should be the focus for anyone who's trying to develop a deeper understanding of why it is that Pakistan is in its current shape.
Excellent. So if I summarize at the risk of oversimplification, so you're suggesting that the contradictions that we see currently in Pakistan, whether in terms of personality clashes or institutional clashes, are manifestation of these three underlying processes: one, demographic change; two, economic stagnation; and three, technological change. Now, I'll pick on the second one, economic stagnation, as I'm interested in issues related to economics and political economy. Historically, the progressives and the left-leaning economists generally have focused on issues of redistribution, and that is, they argue that folks at the top get more, so we need to redistribute so that folks at the bottom, the working class and middle classes, get higher share in the income or wealth distribution. But in your recent piece, you argue that we need to go beyond this. So tell us why not focusing on redistribution is the only way forward.
So I think the progressives, and I broadly associate myself with the same camp, is that the left or the progressives shifted towards redistribution as the benchmark for what they think the economy should be after they decided that private property and the market-based sort of mechanism of production is the default baseline. And we need to find a way in which we can tame some of its more excessive tendencies, right? And so redistribution became the answer for that, is that you allow surplus to be accumulated, you allow profits to be accumulated, you allow wealth to be accumulated, and then you just take some of that from the top and you redistribute it to the bottom. And I think that works. I think that's as a strategy that was the basis of sort of the so-called golden era of capitalism from the 1940s to the 1970s in much of the West. It also formed the basis of pretty strong capital labor sort of relations in the global South during the 1960s. But I think it's inadequate as an approach for where we are currently in the Pakistani context, because our context right now is characterized by the absence of growth, right? The absence of what we would classify as surplus value production, right? There is no surplus value being produced, which can then be redistributed down, or at least the rate at which it is produced, or at least the patterns in which it is produced, is not sustainable at all, right? So, which is why we need to sort of have not just a focus on welfare, right, or not just have a focus on redistribution, but rather on thinking of ways in which we can expand the very pie that we seek to redistribute in the first place, right? To some, this may not sound very different from sort of the classic capitalist sort of view on trickle down, right? That you just allow capital to sort of to function, and you allow sort of the market to make those decisions, and that will automatically lead to sort of a rising tide which will lift all the boats, right? But we distinguish on the left, and sort of within sort of people who believe in a sort of progressive political economy, we believe that pathway to a certain type of, or to a more productive arrangement as far as the economy is concerned, has to at least come through the state in some form or the other, right? And the state cannot take on, in the current scenario, cannot necessarily take on the act of production, but it can certainly use its power as the most organized and most well-resourced institution in society to direct production in a way that maximizes both growth, but also enhances sort of the possibility of redistribution and welfare, being sort of being maximized, right? So I think that is where I want to sort of shift the focus, and I'm not alone on this. A lot of other people have talked about this as well. Is that within sort of those who are those who are sort of who are frustrated with the mainstream, a conversation on the economy should necessarily push in a direction which talks about growth, but growth that actually works for the entire population.
Interestingly, and now here I would like to quote you. So, in your piece, you argue that what will definitely not work is given the Pakistani state, i.e., the bureaucracy, more control of economic processes. Now, this is where I think the traditional or orthodox left wing would disagree, or you're again, left is a broad term. There are, of course, traditions within left which are critical of state control, and there are for more decentralization. So, in other words, you would be okay with, let's say, privatization of PIA on this premise that, oh, it's not necessarily better that a state bureaucrat appoints CEO rather than a stakeholders of a firm appoint.
I mean, I think we tend to pick these battles, which are, I feel like they're generally not particularly useful for the larger objective that of a fairer, of more prosperous society that we want to work in. PIA is so the issue with PIA is that it serves no welfare purpose, as far as I'm concerned. Right, the welfare purpose that PIA serves is of the employees of PIA, who are infinitely better off than employees or wage earners in most other sectors of the economy, right? So for me, the privatization of PI is not necessarily a hill that one should die on, right? However, say the privatization of the power sector, on the other hand, is something, because energy is again a central input into how productive processes are supposed to work, and the state should use its heft in some form or the other to direct it. But I have another frustration with the state, and with the Pakistani state in particular, right? And that frustration is born out of the political landscape under which the Pakistani state operates. I'm trying to make here is that the Pakistani state in its current configuration is simply not accountable enough for bureaucrats to make decisions that are in the interest of the majority, or are the interest of the welfare as a whole, right? And that is partly because of the authoritarian legacy, that is partly because of capture, that is partly because that the bureaucracy or the overdeveloped state, as Alavi put it. So we should be thinking of ways to democratize the state, right? And to democratize the economy without necessarily transferring more power to the bureaucracy, right? That in particular is sort of a view that I'm increasingly coming around to. It's underformed in my head, but that certainly seems to be the view that I want to sort of espouse as well.
And building on this, I mean, the binary in which the left has constrained itself based on the 20th century experiences with planned socialist economies is that either you have state-controlled central planning or market-based unregulated economy. But what about an alternative, an intermediary, where it's the at the level of firm, the workers who directly participate in production processes control and manage what to do in terms of production processes, how to reinvest, and how to make decisions about distribution. In other words, that the democracy at workplace kind of
Yeah.
approach. So we need to go beyond, and I agree with you on this. We shouldn't restrict ourselves to this binary of either state bureaucrats should control it, or whether we should have the private enterprises run in an authoritarian manner. Now,
So, sorry, Danish, I just wanted to add one very small point to this, which is that you need democracy at the workplace, but you also very desperately need democracy at the place of residence, which is what decentralization and local governments actually do. Because, I mean, ultimately, if people are responsible for controlling their own resources, land use, zonal planning, the use of waterways, for example, the use of, all public infrastructure, if you devolve that decision making down to where people actually have a stake in the day-to-day way that decisions are made and in their day-to-day lives, that has fundamental implications for how the economy itself is managed, right? Whereas if you outsource all of those decisions to bureaucrats, opaque, sort of unaccountable bureaucrats who are residing far, far away, right? That obviously leads a very different type. That is going to generate a rentier economy by its very design, right? So I think democracy both at the workplace, but democracy at the place of residence, and both of these collectively can solve partly the problem of economic stagnation that we encounter.
no, great point. And actually, that's the whole agenda of building an inclusive economy, is to extend the scope of democracy from the mere electoral
Mm.
exercise to economic sphere, where most adults spend most of their life, right? 9 to 5,
Exactly.
traditionally
Yeah.
speaking. So that place should be democratized. Now, in a recent research piece with International Center of Tax and Development, you focused on a very interesting concept of Zakat and try to understand how it acts as a way of redistribution. So tell us about that research, and and the way I understand it's still an ongoing project.
So thanks. I mean, so that research this is part of a larger project that we've been doing on what we call informal social protection or informal welfare in the global south. And we had an earlier iteration of this project that looked at Egypt, Morocco, and Pakistan. And then we decided to sort of tunnel down in Pakistan, try to get a better sense of how Zakat as a philanthropic social welfare initiative actually works here, right? And we were able to run a survey and sort of collect interviews and sort of do some analysis. And what we found is that it's a pretty significant amount that gets distributed on an annual basis in the form of zakat. And this is separate from other forms of charitable giving like sadaqah or fitrana and so on and so forth. So zakat on its own is about 600 billion rupees. That's the estimate that we've come up with. Obviously, all sorts of caveats associated with how we've drawn up this, but that's one figure. It's the first estimation that we know of total amount of zakat giving in Pakistan. Now, the reason why I'm partly interested in this is well, there are two reasons. The first reason is that it just helps us understand again the material foundations on which Pakistani society actually works, right? I mean, if we're talking about an economy that is stagnating, we're talking about a pretty heavy cost of living crisis that sort of swept over the country over the last three and a half years, then we really need to know how are people surviving. And these informal redistributive mechanisms, in fact, this is a conversation that I had with Dr. Asim Sajad Akhtar a while back, which is that we simply don't really know what the full extent of the material economy in Pakistan is because such a large part of it is informal in nature, right? And so informal giving is part of that net that allows subsistence to operate in a country that has otherwise experienced multiple economic crises over the last decade or so, right? So that was the first motivation. The second motivation is to think about how zakat or these informal forms of social giving actually run against the other type of fiscal relationship that citizens have, which is with the state through taxation, right? So because people take matters into their own hands when it comes to giving out charity and to giving out to people that they think are needy, does that have an implication on how they would want to pay taxes to the state or whether they would want to pay taxes to the state as well, right? So one hypothesis that is commonly given, it's something that we also mention in everyday conversation, is that people in Pakistan are happy to pay zakat, but they're not happy to pay taxes, right? So that empirical relationship is something that we were interested in exploring a bit further as well. And so the second part is still sort of preliminary. I don't want to sort of get too much into the analysis that we have here. But the first part, which is that there is a lot of informal redistribution, informal welfare that is happening in Pakistan. I think that's again not a big surprise to anyone, but it's good to see it quantified. If that's what we thought was useful, it's good to see it quantified. And that this outlay is larger than what Pakistan's flagship social protection scheme, the Benazir Income Support Program, gives out in a single year.
And this also illustrates that people are interested in redistribution, but it's that the lack of trust on state institutions that seems like a big obstacle. Now,
I'm sorry. So just on that, so Danish, on the lack of trust in state institutions, I think the state. It's important to remember that in Pakistan, the state operates a zakat fund. The state actually collects zakat from a range of financial instruments. But the people voluntarily giving to the zakat state fund is almost minuscule, right? It's less than 1% of total zakat giving, and that really just shows that they don't trust the state to redistribute. They would much rather take matters into their own hands and give it to people that they themselves find needy and those people who they think are in need.
Now, as in recent weeks, the tariffs are in the limelight, and especially after Pakistan also faced increasing tariffs from Trump's administration. So tell us about how you conceptualize these tariffs and what political economic consequences Pakistan can have. And especially, we hear a lot of talk about Pakistani policymakers emphasizing the need to develop trade relations with the United States rather than focusing on aid. So is
Yeah.
this an opportunity for Pakistan?
Yeah, so I think this entire sort of this entire sort of pivot towards tariffs and how tariffs have come into the limelight. Actually, it's interesting that it goes back to this other theme that we've been discussing pretty much throughout this conversation, which is inequality and redistribution, right? So the supposed case for tariffs that is being made in the U.S. is that hey, we had these good jobs which allowed for prosperity. And then all of those jobs went abroad, and now we're just left with service sector, underemployed, sort of precarious work. And we need to reshore a lot of those jobs back, and we need to relive that sort of again that golden era that was between the 40s and the 70s. And there's all sorts of gender-based ideologies that are associated with it, and all sorts of other sort of tendencies here. So the tariff becomes sort of they become like a symbol, or they become like almost like an intervention of sorts to relive like a past that has obviously gone long gone, right? So I feel like that this question of inequality and redistribution is making states do things that they would have not necessarily thought of as viable even just a few years back. When it comes to Pakistan specifically, obviously Pakistan has a small trade surplus with the United States, and that has implications for why Pakistan has also experienced rising tariffs. So beyond the base 10% that Trump has imposed on everyone, Pakistan I think also has maybe it's a 40% or 35% tariff rate that Trump has levied onto Pakistan. Now, the conversations are ongoing based on whatever has been reported in the news that Pakistani policymakers are trying to get a trade agreement. And one of the things in which they can that they've offered is that they can source wheat and cotton imports from the U.S. as a way of balancing out that trade surplus. And that seems to be the way in which they sort of at least make nice with the Trump administration. But again, here it seems like the driving imperative is mostly political and sort of geopolitical in some ways, rather than a sort of a considered view on how can Pakistan use this particular opening or use this particular sort of event as a way of changing up its sort of economic strategy. I don't think there's any sort of serious thinking happening on that front, but rather it is how do we win favor with the Trump administration by sort of offering greater market access and providing them with a source for American exports, right?
Now, the markets have taken these tariffs in not a positive way, to say the least, right? They've seen this as a huge exogenous shock. And there's a lot of talk about now restructuring of the international political economic order and the emergence of new regional blocs and countries focusing on trade with each other, because where the Trump administration faces a huge challenge, on the one end, they try to reduce trade deficit while maintaining dollar as the global reserve
Yeah,
currency, and without going into details, that seems like a contradiction that
that's
it's
a
hard to
conflict.
manage both at the same time. So, and given there's a new Cold War 2.0 emerging between the United States and West and the China and the uh, rest in the global South. So how do you see these tariffs pushing the needle in one way or the other?
So I think there are certain foundations of the global economic order that seem to be unraveling. So again, trade liberalization, which was one of the sort of intellectual foundations on which the post Bretton Woods economic order was set up, people have been selectively moving out of that for a while. And I think China's example of as a state that has done very well on selective engagement with the global economy, I think really sort of now stands as an exemplar for many other states in the global south. So I think that sort of effect, the China effect, is sort of very categorical. Similarly, with America pursuing more autarkic policies, pursuing sort of this approach of trying to sort of bring back certain types of industries. I think that in itself is going to lead to again a withdrawal of economic ties between different parts of the world with each other. The Europeans have already said that they're going to seek out independent relationships with other parts of the world because America can no longer be seen as a reliable ally, especially the kind of decisions that are being made. So I think there is a major restructuring that's happening. What we're not sure is what is going to emerge out of this, right? Because the way that the sort of the current system works, and you probably know this better than I do, is the current system works is that dollar hegemony was underscored by American political and military might across the world, and especially in the Middle East with the use of the petrodollar, right? So, is America going to sort of ensure that dollar hegemony remains in place through the use of its sort of again, sort of strategic, relations and power relations in the Middle East, or is it going to withdraw? In this sort of fit of insularity and autarky that they seem to be pursuing, and what's going to take its place, right? Are we going to see China and the yuan emerge as like a sort of a currency that people can have trades with? I mean, a lot of countries have developed sort of currency swap mechanisms with China over the last few years, but is that sufficient for us to actually see a new global trade regime emerging? I think that's where this is all sort of it's all up in the air, right? And it's like a variety of morbid symptoms seem to have appeared, but we don't know sort of what is going to come out of it, right? And to paraphrase Gramsci. So I feel like that's the current situation that we're in as far as the global economic order is concerned.
We are in the midst of huge war hysteria in South
Mhm.
Asia, especially in India. So I think it's imperative to get your take on it, and in a different way, because there's a lot of talk about that. But I want your take as a critical thinker. What can critical voices and progressives in both India and Pakistan can do to A, normalize relationship, and B, to move towards a paradigm where the both states focus on emancipation and well-being of its marginalized communities rather than
Yeah.
focusing on militarism and this geostrategic gain.
So I think that's exactly what you just said, right? Like, I mean, progressives have we're not in this for chest thumping. We're not in this for beating the war drums. This is not. These are states that are designed as particular types of post-colonial projects. We're not necessarily. They're not emancipatory in sort of in a true sense, or at least they haven't proven to be emancipatory in a true sense. So there's no point rallying behind the state at this particular point in time, right? Obviously, there are problems in both states and there are problems in societies and increasingly it seems like the kind of jingoism that we see from in online spaces from India in particular. I mean that's from and especially from sort of the supporters of the BJP and the sort of the larger right wing ecosystem in India. Those are things that are incredibly disturbing for the region as a whole. But as progressives, our job is to ask for accountability, right? I mean, it's our job to ask for accountability from the state. It's to ask for accountability for what the state has been doing with all the resources that it has at its disposal. Is to ask for who all of this protection is actually for. If those people, in both countries face so many vulnerabilities, whether those are climatic vulnerabilities, economic vulnerabilities, discrimination in all forms. I think that's the common agenda. It's to look past sort of nationalist. It's to look past sort of blinkered territorial views on what should be and what shouldn't be, but rather to look at what is in the common good and what is sort of and obviously to center the plight of the Kashmiri population in this entire instance, right? Like if this is an issue about Kashmir, then what are Kashmiri voices, for example, saying about all of this, right? It is incumbent on progressives in both countries to center those voices and to really sort of give them the platform to make a decision and to sort of raise this issue of accountability. And I think that's where we stand as a progressive, as someone who has a cultural affinity with the region as a whole and who doesn't necessarily buy into like a status project of nationalism in any form. I find the current atmosphere incredibly depressing, not just because of what the Pakistani state is doing, but also what we see in India with the Indian state and obviously its sort of supporters on the right, in such great numbers. So yeah, so I think that's how sort of I would see it.
Thank you, Umair, for sharing your perspective. Until next time, this is Danish Khan signing off from Fiscal Focus on Dawn News English.